Subsistence for Alaskan Natives. This essay is about Alaskan Native subsistence. I will be going over the types of subsistence food used, as well as the ways the Alaskan Natives hunted and gathered these resources. The information I will be presenting has been gathered from weeks 3 and 4 of this anthropology class. For millennia, Alaskan Natives, including Athabaskan, Eskimo, Tlingit, and Aleut groups, subsisted on a vast array of wild country foods, including regionally available sea mammals, ungulates such as caribou and moose, fresh and saltwater fish, migratory waterfowl, berries, root crop gardens, and other botanical resources. In terms of sheer numbers, fish stands out as the dominant component of the country food system, but often other game species play the iconic cultural keystone roles in these communities. Moose and caribou in the interior, whale and walrus on the coast, for instance. The harvest and consumption of subsistence or country foods for rural residents is particularly important in terms of nutritional needs, such as protein and calories, and also for the role that these food and food harvests activities play in the maintenance of social and cultural well-being. These country foods play various roles in the health of these people and their communities, with procurement, preparation, storage, and distribution of these foods each representing important social and cultural movements in local foodways. For instance, hunting, fishing, and preparation activities have been shown to provide an important sense of role and responsibility within families and communities, and serve as essential aspects of childhood and pedagogy. The significant overall diversity of country foods has made for a resilient and self-reliant food system, providing people with valuable options for adapting and responding to changes in the weather, landscape, and annual and seasonal variability in the distribution and availability of fish and game. Historically, the Aetna followed an annual round based on sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior. By taking game, fish, and wild plants in quantity during the spring, summer, and fall, and efficiently storing their food in large underground caches for winter use, the Aetna managed to hedge against starvation. After salmon fishing in late May and June, families moved upland to hunt large game, pick berries, and fish for non-salmon species such as whitefish. With the onset of cold weather, people returned to the Copper River to congregate in large multi-family winter houses where they remained until supplies of dried meat and fish ran low. During the coldest months of the year, the Aetna often dispersed in small groups until March or April, when they again gathered at lakes to hunt migratory waterfowl and muskrats, and fish for grayline and whitefish. After breakup, they moved back to the Copper River to fish for salmon. Fishing and marine life hunting were the principal economic pursuits of the Fox Island Aleuts during Aboriginal times, and both constitute one of the major activities of the present-day acculturated natives. Practices and techniques of hunting and of food preparation have changed vastly with the social acculturation which a century and a half have thrust upon the pre-white population. Aboriginal food sources have in some instances disappeared altogether, i.e. the seal, sea otter, and whale have been so nearly exterminated that they form only the most minor part in the modern diet. During the summer, fish are abundant, and men, women, and children occupy themselves almost wholly in catching, drying, salting down, and preparing for immediate consumption considerable quantities of fish. Principal fish caught from March until November is salmon, and at other times halibut and codfish predominate. All fish may be taken in nets from the open sea, the men working from small power dories or sailing dories common to the Bristol Bay cannery fleets. During the salmon runs up the small streams, which feed back to many of the tundra lakes of the islands, the fish are caught by hand, in dip nets, in buckets by grasping them behind the gills with bare hands, and sometimes with the press of swimming salmon becomes so great that an occasional fish flops out onto the shore to be picked up by children. Fox Island group, which includes Unalaska, Unimak, and Unmak, lies directly in the path of the annual salmon migrations from the North Pacific to Bristol Bay. Through the straits and passes between the islands, hordes of salmon migrate, literally filling all the adjacent waters with the wealth of their numbers, hence their value to the native food economy, both in pre-white times and in the modern period. In Aboriginal times, the ocean-dwelling fish were caught in straight web nets or seines, which used wooden floats carved from driftwood, usually cedar or fir. Flat andesite stones, through which a central hole had been drilled, were tied to the bottom of these nets to weigh them down. In modern times, commercial fishermen's nets are used, floated by wood, cork, or glass balls, and weighted with lead sinkers. At Unmak, most frequently during the king salmon to silver salmon runs, one end of the net will be fastened to the shore immediately in front of the village, with the far end anchored from 100 to 200 feet out in the bay. The average copper river sockeye salmon weighs approximately 6 pounds round weight. Depending on what proportion of the fish is kept and used, 50 to 60 salmon would provide 300 pounds of food per household each year. The head and entrails weigh approximately 1 pound, but if the fish is filleted, the proportions would be different. These subsistence salmon are important to the well-being of their households, making up approximately 24% of their yearly food supply. Most of them freeze, smoke, and can their salmon and share their harvest with family and friends. Virtually all indigenous Northwest Coast groups collected and ate shellfish. Gathering techniques and technology were similar across the region and comparable to those of other coastally adapted groups throughout the world. Surface-dwelling and rock-perching taxa were gathered by hand or removed with a pry. Burrowing taxa, such as clams and some cockles, were dug up with a simple wooden digging stick. Sea urchins could be picked up during extremely low tides, speared, or collected in a dip net. Fresh shellfish were carried in large, durable, open-weave baskets outfitted with trunk lines. Woven bark mats were used by some groups when kneeling to dig clams or as protection against water draining from the open-weave carrying baskets. Although perishable digging sticks, baskets, and bark mats rarely survived in archaeological contexts, the wet site of Lachine produced the oldest known clam digging sticks. These heavy stitch with weighted knob handles and fire-hardened tips may be as many as 2,000 years old. In the tidewater pools attached to the rocks and sea bottom are found large number of mollusca. At low tides, these shellfish are above water and be gathered by a sharp blow, which loosens them from the rock surface. Because of the heavy seas driven against the northern coasts, fewer shellfish are to be found there, and those clinging to the tidewater rocks are often impossible to reach. In protected coves along the fords of the deeply indented islands, hard-shell clams bury themselves in the coarse sand. On Unmak Island, which is unprotected without fords, no clams are found, although these inlets of adjacent Unalaska Island abound with clams of extraordinary size. The Aleutians take full advantage of the various species of shellfish available along with the low tide shores. These are eaten raw when away from the village, or cooked if there is time to make a fire. The hard shell clam is gathered in large quantities by the natives and whites alike from the Unalaska village and Dutch harbor. They have advised an ingenious method for efficient digging. This consists of backing a power dory up to the beach where it is held while full power ahead is coaxed from the engine. The violently churning propeller churns up the sand to a depth of 2 to 3 feet, allowing for the succulent clams to surface. As a rule, only the larger mollusks, those approximating 4 to 6 inches across, are gathered, and it is not unusual to pick up several gunny sacks of clams from 5 minutes of such power digging. The razor clam is not known to the Fox Island Aleutians. In older times, the hard-shell clams were dug with a digging stick and a tapered point. These varied in length from 2 to 4 feet. Some shellfish were consumed raw on occasion. More often, they were boiled, steamed, roasted, or baked. Shellfish could be sun-dried or dried and smoked for winter storage or trade. The shells of some species provided a source of raw material for a variety of functional tools and ornaments. Mussel shells were chipped and or ground into knives, harpoon heads, scrapers, adze or chisel bits, and other tools. With little modification, clamshells served as spoons, ladles, or containers. Beads of clamshells and alivella were made by chipping, drilling, and grinding. Rattles were made of large scallop shells that washed up on the beach during storms. Bulk or turban shell opercula were used as decorative insets or inlay. Shellfish were also used for fish bait and as a source of lime used in tobacco chewing. Burnt and crushed clamshells might also be presented at a potluck for the latter purpose. Blanca's Onet has proposed that the shell was used as a construction material in site engineering. Without minimizing these other uses, the vast majority of shell found in the Northwest Coast archaeological sites appears to represent food refuse. Sea mammals of several species were used by the old-time Aleutians for food, clothing, and skin boats, and sometimes for shelter. Only the last has practically disappeared during modern times, although it, too, was considerable importance in pre-white days. One must not judge the availability of the sea mammals in the primitive times by the conditions which prevail today, when all the species have been brought almost to the point of extinction. For the primitive Aleutians, this source of food supply was almost inexhaustible. For the modern Aleut, the occasional mammal is killed and looked upon as a delicacy to be shared equally by all members of the community. The fur seals migrate annually from their winter home off of the California and Mexican coasts, through the island passes to their breeding grounds on the Privilege Islands. In ancient times, these were hunted with the harpoon, but in these later days, the herds of fur seal are so carefully guarded by the American Coast Guard patrol vessels that it is seldom that one is killed near any of the inhabited islands. Little is known today about the aboriginal vegetal foods, since this source of nutriment has been almost entirely displaced by trade foods. Nevertheless, some native vegetable foods are secured and eaten, in addition to that grown in small truck gardens. None of the cultivated produce grows well in the damp, cold climate, and gardening is desultory during the spring and summer. Whenever one of the major game animals is brought in, the community shares as a cooperative association in the division of the animal. Such an animal is seldom killed and brought in by a single hunter, but usually through the combined efforts of several men. The game animal is considered to belong not to the man who killed it, but to the whole community. Example, men, women, and children, whether they had any relatives taking part in that hunt or not. The facet of communal ownership is as strong today as in pre-white times, and reflects the early Eskimo culture pattern underlying the thin veneer of acculturation patent today. When a large animal is killed, it is usually out at the sea. If killed by harpoon, one or more lines are already attached to the body and the animal can be towed ashore. But if killed by rifle, it is necessary to sink a harpoon head with attached line into the sinking carcass before it settles out of sight in the ocean's depths. Once a line has been attached, the